75 years ago, the Jews of Germany experienced Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It turned out to be a prelude to the Holocaust. On the eve of this anniversary, German Chancellor Angela Merkel bemoaned that Jewish institutions are in need of police protection. Why, 75 years later, does hostility to Jews persist? We'll debate that uncomfortable question tonight. And it's been another rough week for Toronto's Mayor Rob Ford. He's admitted to drug use. Yet another video has surfaced showing inexplicable behavior. Councillors and citizens, friends and foes alike are calling for his resignation. Tonight, in our story of the week, with 1 in 3 Canadians living in large cities, what do Ford's foibles say about our complicated relationship with municipal governance? And that's where we begin, tonight on The Agenda.
Funding for The Agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Ontario's more than 36,500 chartered professional accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at cpaontario.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Rob Ford's troubles have cost him major support on Toronto City Council. Many are asking him to resign or take a leave of absence, while others seek to strip him of some of his powers. Despite it all, he's vowing to remain in office, work through the last year of his term, and then seek re-election. Can Ontario's capital city continue to function amidst this unprecedented craziness? And if so, what does this say about municipal governance in Canada? Joining us now to help answer that, Dennis Pilon. He is professor in the Department of Political Science at York University. Nice to have you back here at TVO.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's start with this business about the 2 Toronto City councillors who are trying to, as we suggested in the opening there, put forward a motion to remove some of the mayor's powers, for example, to put whom he wants on the city's executive committee. If that were to happen, what exactly would the mayor be at that point?
Well, I think people need to understand that the model that we use in Canada is called a weak mayor system. So we have a directly elected mayor, but they don't have a lot of power independent of council. Many people characterize our mayors as just another vote. Now, in Toronto, the mayor does have some independent appointment powers, and he can move his issues up the agenda more easily than others, but really not a lot of extra perks for being the mayor.
He does set the agenda, though, for council meetings, doesn't he, and for executive committee meetings?
Well, for his executive committee meetings, definitely. But again, so that he has some power, but not a lot. I mean, if you compare it, for instance, to the strong mayor systems in the United States, someone like Michael Bloomberg in New York City, I mean, they run an administration in the same way that Obama, runs his administration. He is the government.
Yeah, he can veto.
But he can also initiate a great deal. I mean, when he needs money, he has to go to Congress. Now, that's obviously different than the Canadian system, where our executive is lodged within the legislature at the provincial and federal level.
We have been, I guess, through the course of the revelations of the last several days, I guess lots of people have been thinking, what can a city do at this point to get rid of a mayor that it thinks is out of control and doesn't want anymore? What's the answer to that?
Well, under the current rules, they can't do anything. Unless he's charged and convicted, he's going to stay there. So, some people have mooted a few ideas. Could we have recall legislation? Some people have suggested that. I mean, to me, this is kind of part and parcel of the problem when you have a mixed system like we do. We have inherited and mixed elements of the British approach to local government with the American approach. So we have a weak mayor system, which puts the power in council, like the British, and yet we have a directly elected mayor, not like the British until recently, and we expect that mayor to represent the city in a way that's different than the local councillors. So this is a system that's kind of ripe for conflict, and it's interesting that for the most part, we haven't had that much conflict using this system in most places.
Well, this is unprecedented, what's going on right now. So perhaps it's not surprising that the screams for recall aren't there. What do you think of recall, incidentally?
I think it's the wrong way to go about it. I mean, you're going to initiate a lot of cost to have a recall campaign. Wouldn't it be better to get the system right up front? If we want to keep a directly elected mayor, I think it was a mistake to move from a 3-year term to a 4-year term, precisely because it's a fixed election date at the municipal level. 3 years was a better idea rather than 4. The argument that people made about moving to a 4-year system was, well, it'll be like our provincial and federal houses, but they're not the same. At the federal level, the government can fall. At the federal level, a leader can be moved out if enough people are unhappy with them. Whereas with a directly elected mayor, you're kind of stuck with them.
What do you think about the argument that if you had recall, meaning presumably after a whatever period of time, 6 months, whatever, if the people didn't like the job the mayor was doing, they could launch a campaign to get rid of the mayor. One of the arguments I've heard is that absolves people of their responsibility to think hard about their choice on Election Day and get it right on Election Day. What do you think of that argument?
Well, again, I think the problem with the recall is it's a negative move instead of a positive one. I think that what we want is a democratic experience which says to people, get out there, express yourself, try to get the government or the influence that you think we should have, and then let's have people work it out in council. I mean, look, if I had my druthers, I'd say let's scrap the way we do it, have a proportional system to electing our council, precisely so that elections happen, but the deliberation doesn't end there. Precisely so that the politicians continue to work with the public to move the issues forward. The problem with our system is the politicians get elected and then a lot of them stop listening. And really, there's very little the public can do. They get one vote now every 4 years, and everything they want is riding on that vote. Absolutely everything they hope. And politicians get elected, and then they take those votes for granted and do any number of things.
One of the expressions we hear all the time is that municipalities are creations of the province, meaning the province has the power. And in this case, some people are saying the province ought to, in some way, shape, or form, intervene, either through any number of different mechanisms. Would you advise that?
Absolutely not. Churchill said that democracies, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like,
it's the worst form of government except for everything else.
And I would agree with that. Our system may not be working, but I would rather leave the decision with the people, however flawed the decision-making process is, rather than have politicians go in and decide over the heads of the public that this guy's not doing the job. By all accounts, many in the public are prepared to grant Ford credit for the work that he's done as a politician on the issues. They just don't like his bad behavior. It doesn't appear that some of them are prepared to punish him.
The politics of this are somewhat problematic insofar as there's a Liberal government at Queen's Park and Ford is clearly a Conservative. Are the optics of a Liberal government intervening on a Conservative municipally just a bridge too far?
Again, I think that the politicians, even if it were a Liberal, would be very reticent to move on this. Precisely because he did have a significant amount of support. I mean, 46%. Okay, a majority of Torontonians didn't want him, but a lot did. So politicians are, that's the third rail. You don't want to touch that because you yourself are going to go back to the public and ask for a mandate to introduce the different things that you want to do.
Well, what about this? What about the province changing the provincial law, the City of Toronto Act, to enable the city councillors themselves to do what they feel is necessary? Maybe sanction, suspend, kick out, whatever. How about that?
I don't want to let the city council off the hook. There's a lot they can do right now, and they could have done it a long time ago.
Like what?
The movement to defang the mayor, as we're hearing people characterize it, by taking away what few powers he has that are distinct from other councillors. Make the mayor just another councillor. Sure, he's a councillor at large. We used to have mixed systems here in Canada where people were elected in a local riding and then a number of councillors were elected at large to represent the city as a whole. Maybe that's the role that the mayor plays, rather than having some kind of privileged position. I think the councillors could have intervened long before this to take leadership. If they didn't like what the mayor's doing, they could have done it, but they couldn't agree amongst themselves.
Okay, but you've already pointed out in a weak mayor system, his fangs are pretty short to begin with. So if you defang a guy with short fangs already, you're not doing a heck of a lot. What about the idea of the municipal affairs minister at Queen's Park initiating a process whereby you amend the City of Toronto Act so that the city councillors themselves can kick the guy out if they want him out?
Well, they have different bases of support. So I think immediately people would cry foul and say, this person is elected on the basis of a local area to represent, I guess, those local interests. That's what people would say. The mayor has an agenda that encompasses the whole city. So to have the council basically throw the mayor out, some people would say, if that's dirty pool. That's not really consistent.
Well, presumably there'd be a threshold you have to cross, and presumably that threshold's been crossed, hasn't it?
Well, maybe the threshold itself needs to be the issue. Maybe you'd need a 2/3 majority on council to make such a change. I mean, look, if we don't think the mayor-centric approach is the right way to go, then maybe we should just get rid of the mayor. Why have a mayor? Many localities around the world have elected councils that basically elect a mayor from amongst their ranks. Many of the directly elected presidents around the world are largely symbolic posts. In England, the mayor is a symbolic post. So, yeah, I've always sort of thought that this focus on the great leader who somehow will lead us, out of the wilderness is a bit superficial democratically.
Do you think there's something in the water these days in places like Toronto and Montreal and London where there is a mayor in office at the moment who's been charged and yet who has not stepped aside? He's going to continue to serve the end of his term. Mayor Ford hasn't been charged, but his behavior has been controversial, let's put it that way. As of late, Montreal has seen 2 mayors resign from office under a cloud. What in heaven's name is going on?
I think that we may just be finding out more of the kinds of things that had always been going on. So in the case of Quebec, it would appear that the corruption that's being discovered is not new. It's just we're finding out about it now. And we could look, for instance, at some of the things that are going on in the Senate. And there it's just shifting the goalposts. I mean, the Senate always was a place where politicians, parties, put their money fixers. That's where the bagmen went. It was a way of giving them an income while they went out and rattled the chains to get money for the party. Now people think that that shouldn't happen. Okay, but don't pretend that that's not what the Senate was for, because that's what it was being used for before.
But I remember 20 years ago, I think it was, maybe it's 25 years ago, there was a 2-year term on city council. And then they decided they wanted a third because they were a more mature level of government and they felt they needed more time, and so they got a third. And then they decided they needed a 4th year. Some of them decided they needed a 4th year, and I think it was the Harris government that gave them that 4th year. So they're now on a par with other levels because they don't like to be referred to as the junior level of government. They feel they're as legitimate and as important to people's lives, as they are in some respects, as any other. But you really got to scratch your head lately. I mean, they're acting like they're really acting badly, a lot of them lately, aren't they?
I would agree, and that's why I think the move...
But we have no recourse.
Well, that's where I think a 3-year term was a better form of recourse. Precisely because it's a fixed election date, a 3-year term gives people a chance to comment on the politicians more regularly. And also, because there isn't a party system, it's very hard for the public to keep track of who's responsible for what. Again, a 3-year term, I think, increases the accountability. The 4-year term was a mistake.
It was a deal. I remember. It was a deal. Voter turnout, as we know, stinks. Municipal voter turnout is chronically less than 50%. I think last time it was a little over 50 just because the personalities involved in this city anyway were really quite extraordinary. What effect do you think these scandals will have on voter turnout a year from now? And we're going back to the polls less than a year from now, actually.
Well, generally, we know from the study of politics that scandals and negative politics turn people off. However, this is a particular case. And in this case, because Ford is such a polarizing figure, and because he appears to inspire such a considerable amount of loyalty, I think that it will inspire some of those supporters to come back. The last election was obviously motivated by a number of proximate issues. The garbage strike probably motivated a number of people into politics who don't normally participate. They may fall off the voting wagon. And then I think the performance of David Miller left a lot of progressives discouraged, and they may have stayed home. They'll come back in the next election. Now, the other factor is the funders. These politicians don't get elected without money, and I think some of those funders are going to say, can Rob Ford still win? When people look at the coalition that elected Rob Ford, they only ever focus on the Ford Nation. But the Ford Nation doesn't comprise all of the people that support him. There's a lot of just conservatives, right-of-center voters, who don't buy into the populism, but nonetheless said, who's the guy who can win? And he was the guy who looked like he could win.
And they liked his agenda.
Sure.
They thought his center-right agenda was right on.
Yep.
Does this reflect, though, I mean, in some American cities, I got to believe that if what was going on here were going on there, there'd be 5,000 people in front of City Hall protesting the next day saying, we got to get rid of this guy. We saw a few hundred people at City Hall the other day. Now, I know another demonstration's coming up, but do you think the public's too apathetic on this?
Again, I think public mores are changing. We've seen a number of candidates, throughout the U.S. and Canada who've emerged from scandals and managed to get themselves reelected. So I think it's the character of the scandal. I think it's also the character of the individual. You know, if this was someone who had never had any issues before, I think the public would be shocked. But they're not that shocked at Rob Ford. He's inoculated us against shock because he's always been a shocking politician. So some people might say, well, what did you expect? We didn't expect this, but we probably expected something like this because he's always delivered that kind of stuff in politics.
Dennis, thanks for coming in and sharing your views on this. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Dennis Pilon, York University. Up next, 75 years after Kristallnacht, is anti-Semitism on the rise? It has been called the longest hatred anti-Semitism. Despite the 6 million Jews who perished during the Second World War, various forms of prejudice against Jews are still very much part and parcel of public discourse. Much of it could be reduced to conspiratorial ideas as to why 0.2% of the world's population continues to have the visibility and influence that it does. 75 years ago this weekend in Germany, more than 1,000 synagogues were burned down, more than 7,000 Jewish businesses destroyed, almost 100 people killed, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested and shipped to concentration camps. It's an event known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. As we reflect on that night, we ask why it is that in 2013, a quarter of European Jews are afraid to be recognized as Jews in public, and whether these fears reach the shores of North America. Let's discuss this. First, via Skype in Washington, D.C., with Hussein Ibish. He's a senior fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine. In our nation's capital, Jan Grabowski. He is professor of history at the University of Ottawa and the author of The Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland. And with us here in our studios, Jonathan Kay, the opinions page editor of the National Post. And it's great to have all of you on the program today. I welcome you, Jonathan, here in the studio and our two friends out of town. Let me start by sharing some numbers with you and our audience that I think will set up the discussion here. So control room, let's bring these up if we can. Anti-Semitism in 10 European countries, a survey done, and here are the numbers they came out with according to the Anti-Defamation League. 22% agreeing that Jews are responsible for the death of Christ. 36% agreeing with the statement that Jews have too much power in business. 39% agreeing that Jews exert too much influence over international financial markets. 41% agreeing with the statement, Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. And 55% agreeing with the statement that Jews are more loyal to Israel than their own country. Let's broaden the context a little bit more and look at a similar survey that was taken in the United States this year. And here's what the numbers show. 14% saying Jews have too much power in the United States. 18% agreeing with the statement that Jews have too much influence in the media. 19% saying Jews have too much power in business, 26% saying the Jews killed Christ, and 30% agreeing with the statement that American Jews are more loyal to Israel than to the United States itself. Lower numbers, but still numbers that may cause concern among some. Jan, I want to go to you first, and I want you to help us out, first of all, with an understanding of anti-Semitism in general. There is the anti-Semitism that made the Holocaust possible at one end of the continuum. And then there perhaps is another kind of anti-Semitism that makes some European Jews from Malmö in Sweden to Budapest, Hungary, feel anxious about walking in their streets of their cities. Is there a difference between those two kinds of anti-Semitism in your view?
I mean, the thing is that, of course, anti-Semitism, as you well know, as we all know, is one of the most ancient hatreds that we have encountered, and it's as old as, let's say, as Christianity in any case, probably older than that. So we are talking about stereotypes which are so deeply rooted into Western and not only Western tradition. They are very hard to eradicate. I believe that we have to deal here with very much the same phenomenon, different scale, of course, different means of action. However, at the bottom, if you look at what people think, what stereotypes they touch upon, it is very much the same tradition. And the horror of it is that the numbers that you mentioned, they simply practically do not change. About the killing of Christ, we can go here to the first centuries of our era, and this does not simply change. So I would say we have to deal with the same set of stereotypes within a very different political context. You have a hatred which is on the one hand inspired by religion or religiously somehow motivated. On the other hand, you have a hatred in secular dimension, hatred of the Jews. Now you have additional dimension, last 3 generations, let's say, and this is the hatred centered around the creation and the existence of the state of Israel, which added additional new dimension to the old hatred. So basically you have here old can of worms plus a new one.
Okay, let me follow up with Jonathan Kay, because one of the things that's interesting in the numbers is that the United States obviously has a significant Jewish population, many more Jews in the United States and Canada than in Europe, and yet the numbers are lower in the United States than they are in Europe. The level of anti-Jewish feeling is less where there are more Jews. What do you infer from that?
Well, there are countries where the phenomenon can be taken to an extreme, where there is anti-Semitism with no Jews at all. There are parts of Japan and parts of the Arab Middle East where anti-Semitism is rife, and people have not met a single Jew. So that is not, that's an ancient phenomenon. And you see it, by the way, with other ethnic groups. I mean, there are people in Quebec who are Islamophobic, and many of them haven't actually met a real live Muslim. So we see this with lots of groups. In general, however, when you read statistics like that, I am a little bit skeptical about broad generalizations when you say, oh, things haven't changed, the numbers are... Things have changed. When I hear stories told, my grandfather grew up Jewish in Toronto, and the stories he told me about the way Jews were treated, absolutely night and day compared to the way Jews are treated now. Not only is anti-Semitism much less rife now, but it was largely thanks to the reaction to anti-Semitism that the entire apparatus of human rights, in large part, was created in provinces like Ontario in the 60s and 70s. And that apparatus, in turn, has been used to promote the human rights of other groups. So I think, yes, the survey results can be worrying. You could probably get the same sort of survey results if you ask people about, immigrants or Muslims or gays or even women.
So Jews shouldn't take it personally.
I mean, there's going to be a hardcore of real anti-Semites, but they're extremely marginalized now. And I mean, even in the last 10 years, when I was a journalist, even the number of emails I get that really can be classified as hardcore anti-Semitism, even in the space of the last decade, it has reduced markedly.
Okay, let me also welcome to our discussion now in New York, Lisa Goldman, who's an Israeli-Canadian and a journalist and a blogger. And Lisa, we're glad you could join us for our discussion tonight. I want to point out that you grew up in Vancouver, you have lived in Israel, you now live in New York City, so you have a kind of a broad panoply of experiences on this issue. The numbers that we read off the top of the program showing some, I guess, what some people would consider startling results about anti-Semitism in the world today. Do they surprise you?
I mean, not really, I suppose, but I suppose that's a shocking statement, because I'm going to follow up by saying that anti-Semitism is not a phenomenon that particularly disturbs me. It's not something that weighs on me very heavily. But I did grow up, as you said, in Vancouver, and my family, my grandparents are also grew up in Vancouver, and I was raised on the same kinds of stories that was it Jonathan?
Yes.
Mentioned about his own father in Toronto. My stepfather, for example, was told by the dean of his at his university in Saskatchewan that he and his first cousin, who were the first and second in their class at medical school, at university, should not both try to apply to McGill Medical School the same year, because there was no way McGill would take more than one Jew from Saskatchewan in the same year. So I sort of grew up on those stories, and there were neighborhoods in Vancouver where my mother would point out, Jews hadn't been allowed to rent or buy in schools and clubs and so forth. But I don't really equate prejudice or paranoia with genocidal instincts. For example, in the genocide, the genocide against the Jews, the genesis of that genocide, of course, was in Nazi Germany. But the stories that I grew up hearing from my great-grandparents about anti-Semitism against Jews were in Poland and Russia. which is where they're from. So on the one hand, anti-Semitism is disturbing and ugly, and so is Islamophobia, and so is prejudice against black people, which is far more common in New York than it is against Jews, for example. But I don't fear anti-Semitism. I don't believe there's like there's some kind of a drumbeat toward another genocide against the Jews building
Hussein,
because people dislike Jews.
Forgive me. Hussein, as I welcome you to the discussion now, I want to just preface it by reading a couple of figures, again from the European survey, that relate to the Middle East. And here are the numbers. 28% of the people surveyed agreed that their views about Jews are influenced by the actions of Israel. And 65% agreed with the statement that their opinions of Jews are worse because of the actions of Israel. And I would suspect, Hussein, that the numbers of Muslims in the Middle East whose views about Jews are adversely influenced by the actions of Israelis are undoubtedly much higher. My question is, what's your view on how much influence the conflict in the Middle East has on the perception of Jews?
Well, let's split it up. I think for Europeans and Westerners who are either Christian or come from Christian communities, whatever they believe spiritually, I think it can be an excuse to dislike Jews more than they already do, or to continue to dislike Jews. So it can be an excuse. And I see a lot of people who claim to be pro-Palestinian, but who are actually just anti-Semitic. And this is poisonous to the Palestinian cause. It's a disaster because there has to be reconciliation between Israel and the Palestinians to create two states, to have a peaceful future for both peoples. So the Palestinian national cause cannot survive that kind of anti-Semitism, even in the West. But in particular, and now switching over to the Arab world, I think there's absolutely no analog in traditional Arab culture or Islamic theology and practice to either the traditional religious and folkloric anti-Semitism in Europe of bygone eras, or the sort of pseudo-religious and pseudo-scientific, and political anti-Semitism, both with a capital A and a capital S, which emerged after the emancipation of the Jews in the late 18th and early 19th century, and to which Zionism was a reaction. I think anti-Semitism in the Arab world, in the Middle East, is almost entirely imported from Europe, and especially among the Muslim populations, derives almost exclusively from the conflict. It's an effect rather than a cause, but as long as it goes on, it becomes deeper and deeper, and unfortunately, it's really leaving its traces, both in terms of Arabs disliking Jews because they dislike the history of Israel and Israeli policies, and vice versa. Jewish Israelis exhibiting a huge amount of anti-Arab prejudice, both towards Arabs in general and towards the Arab citizens of Israel, and certainly towards the Arabs who live under Israeli occupation. All of this is an effect rather than a cause of the conflict, but it's still a reality we have to deal with. I do think, though, that it's shallower than what exists in the Christian West. It doesn't draw on any deep cultural or religious traditions.
Jan, let me follow up on those comments, if I could, by quoting something from Maclean's magazine, which published a piece about your book recently, The Hunt for the Jews. I'm not sure you saw this, but one of the comments that was provoked by one of the articles reads like this. It's called No Pity for Jews. They were treated much like Israelis treat Palestinians today and have for 60 years. Remind me again which group I'm supposed to be sorry for. I know that officially I'm only allowed to feel sorry for Jewish victims and not victims of Jews if I don't want my comment disappeared like a Palestinian's rights. What do you make, Jan, of the juxtaposition between Jewish and Palestinian suffering in comments such as those?
Well, this is something that really gets me very upset, actually. The thing is that I am a scholar of the Holocaust, this unprecedented tragedy in, let's not mince words, in human history, and attempts to equate Holocaust, mass murder on industrial scale of the Jewish nation in Europe with sufferings, undeniable sufferings of people elsewhere, simply make me very, very sad, make me very worried. So I'm not surprised. I have been exposed to these comments, of course, before. And from going back to the words of my predecessors in this panel, we do have here a little problem because, for instance, Mr. Kay mentioned that the Jewish situation of the Jews improved. Of course it improved. It's quite obvious that it improved. What I was referring to before was not the physical situation of the Jews, but the existence of stereotypes which can, given the situation, give way to actions which simply cannot be somehow foretold or foreseen. So that's what makes me worried. And of course, the existence of the Middle Eastern conflict exacerbates these problems even further. So that's as far as my comment goes.
Okay, let me follow up with that to Jonathan. And there was something on YouTube about this, and one of the comments, they allow for space to comment on the videos underneath, wrote this, and I want you to comment on this. When someone says to me, Holocaust, I instantly reply, which one? They are not unique, they were not singled out, they are not special. And since the World War II event, there have been no less than a dozen since. Cambodia, Somalia, Ethiopia, Rwanda, just to name a few. And the granddaddy of them all, Mao and the Communist Party in China. Really, the "we are the chosen ones, the only victims of genocide" mantra is getting pretty old. John, what's your view of those who say that they're tired about hearing about the Holocaust or that the Jews are the only people who have suffered?
I wouldn't put that sentiment in those terms, but there is, I guess I can see why there's some basis to it. If you are a Tutsi whose entire family was killed by Hutus in 1994 in Rwanda, a massacre that approached 1 million people, you might feel that the trauma of your community was every bit as great as the Jews suffered. And the same goes for what the Ukrainians suffered under Stalin. Tragically, there's no shortage of these sorts of incidents. I can see why members of these communities would feel that maybe sometimes there is an undue emphasis on this absolutely horrific, tragic element in human history. But I also, on the other hand, you have to say that in terms of pure evil, in terms of killing people for the sake of killing people, it really wasn't even a political project at root. It was a pure extermination for the sake of extermination. In that, especially nihilistic sense, it is difficult to find any analog in human history, in the sense that there really wasn't any rational political aspect to it. It was just pure evil for the sake of evil. I think that's an argument you could make that the Holocaust is indeed unique.
So, Lisa, when we talk about the Holocaust, in your view, should we only use that word in reference to what happened to the Jewish people in World War II?
Well, it's come to have that association now. So to consciously make an effort to use the term Holocaust for other genocides would be, I think, a little forced and probably distracting and unnecessary. Look, the genocide of the Jewish people is important to me because it was the genocide of my people. It's the genocide of a language and a culture and a 1,000-year history in Europe. But it doesn't. I don't feel any need to hold the genocide of my people up as an example of something that was, worse or unique, worse than other genocides or unique in any respect. I mean, you can say that there are unique aspects, that it was industrialized genocide, but there are patterns, I think, to all genocides in the way they're carried out and in the complete lack of rational behavior, and the pure hatred, the psychotic state that the perpetrators are in. I don't feel the need, though, to take the term Holocaust and start applying it to what happened in Rwanda or in Cambodia or in China or in the Ukraine or. I mean, I'm sorry to say it, but of course we all know that there were a lot of genocides in the 20th century.
All right, let me introduce yet another participant in this discussion, and that is the former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, who expressed a particular view of Jews. It was several years ago, but this also is a well-known quote. We'll play a little clip of it and then come back and chat. Roll tape, please.
But today the Jews rule this world by proxy. They get others to fight and die for them. They invented socialism, communism, human rights and democracy so that persecuting them would appear to be wrong, so they may enjoy equal rights with others. With these, they have now gained control of the most powerful countries And they, this tiny community, have become a world power.
Hussein, the Jews, quote unquote, as a world power hiding behind the veil of equal rights. What do you make of that?
Bizarre, slightly unhinged, and unfortunately, it's got a certain currency in the Islamic world because of the misperception of Jewish power in the United States, how it operates, the extent to which it exists and doesn't exist. I mean, it's a real thing. It's disproportionate. It's important, but it's not definitive. I mean, the idea that Jews rule the United States or make the decisions that the United States takes that people in Malaysia or in the Arab world or anywhere else in the Islamic world or anywhere in the world is not true. Those of us who live in Washington understand that. I think what's really fascinating about this sort of spread of what are traditional anti-Semitic calumnies, and that's what you heard from Mahdi and Muhammad. They're very traditional European anti-Semitic calumnies being repeated by a distinctly non-European individual. It's fascinating that Islamophobia regurgitates almost exactly the same sort of accusations against Muslim communities in the West, that they're fifth column, that they worship an alien god, that they're fundamentally, they may look like you or seem like you, but actually they're trying to take over, and they're using immigration as a weapon of war in this clash of civilization against our values and what have you. It's virtually the same thing. And what really sort of gave the game away was Breivik, the mass murderer in Norway, who was inspired in his 1,000-page rant explaining his manifesto before he murdered all those Norwegian children and others, largely by Islamophobic discourse. But he said, the thing is that Jews are not a problem in Europe because the Holocaust took care of that. In the United States, they are a problem. He said, there's too much Jewish power. Here in Europe, the problem is the Muslims, and therefore we should support Israel, and therefore we're mad at the liberals, and therefore I'm going to go on a shooting spree. It's just, once you get into the tangled web of hatred, you find that they tend to double back on themselves very quickly. And anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are intertwined in a very, very disturbed and disturbing way.
Let me ask our control room to bring up our next graphic on this. This is again from the Anti-Defamation League, the so-called Anti-Semitism Index, which goes as follow. How would you answer the following questions? Jews stick together more than other Americans. When asked what is anti-Semitism, Jews always like to be at the head of things. Jews are more loyal to Israel than America. Jews have too much power in the U.S. today. Jews have too much control and influence on Wall Street. Jews have too much power in the business world. Jews have a lot of irritating faults. Jews are more willing than others to use shady practices to get what they want. Jewish business people are so shrewd that others don't have a fair chance at competition. Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind, and Jews are just not as honest as other business people. In defining anti-Semitism, these are the things that tend to be on the checklist. John Kay, the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, once said that anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than is necessary, which is a very clever line. But in any event, can I get you to sort of pick up on this and talk about the notion that Jews seem to occupy, quote unquote, more space or have a disproportionate amount of, a Canadian expression, ice time, I guess, than their numbers would warrant? What do we make of this?
Look, there's a grain of truth to that, and I'm a beneficiary of it. If you look at the media and the business world, it's true. There have been a lot of successful Jews. There's no gainsaying that. In terms of that, surveys like that, I'm a little skeptical, as I say. You know, one of the questions was, do Jews stick together more than other people? Well, of course they do, in the same sense that any community does. I mean, in Canada, you could say the same thing about Tamils, or say the same thing about East Asians. Or, you know, when you have any kind of small religious community relative to the larger society, they do tend to stick together just by virtue of attending weekly Shabbat services. I mean, that's just part of ethnic religious life. So I'm a little skeptical of that sort of thing. I also am just skeptical of measuring anti-Semitism just by sort of asking people abstract questions. To my mind, the real measure of anti-Semitism is what is life like in a society. You know, I have a columnist at the National Post named George Jonas, and he is very troubled by the idea of hate. You know, he says, look, people hate all sorts of things. You know, our minds are weird things. We hate all sorts of things. What really matters is whether our society reflects any of those sort of swirling hates that we have in our mind. And our society that we've built here in Canada, to my mind, it's the least anti-Semitic society in the entire world, including in Israel. I mean, it's a wonderful place in that regard. And if you look at the opportunities that are there for Jews, if you look at the publicly expressed sentiments about Jews, if you look at politicians, business leaders in the media, it feels very sterile and abstract to talk about anti-Semitism in a society that has so thoroughly extinguished anti-Semitism from public life. There are always unpleasant thoughts that lurk below the surface. That's true. But again, as my columnist George Jonas says, if you try and root out thoughts, you can go down other scary paths, because then you go into the sort of the thought crime, that sort of thing. I think we should sort of step back and say, look, this is a very hatred-free society.
Relatively speaking.
You're always going to find random guys on, and that's another thing that bothers me when people say, well, look what this guy wrote on the internet. I mean, the internet, especially the comment threads under articles, is a self-selecting community of people whose attitudes are not expressed in the mainstream of the society around them, and they feel the only way they can express their view is in this obscure way. And so, to a certain extent, those comment threads show us the views that are marginalized within society. I mean, it's terrible that they're there, but it's good that they've been marginalized.
Jan, would you like to follow up on that?
Well, actually, I do agree with Mr. Kay here that as someone who is straddling the Atlantic Ocean, spending half of my time in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe, and the other half of my time here in Canada, I have to say that we should be so proud of this Canadian society, which when compared with other even Western advanced, so to say, societies, stands as an example in terms of freedom of expression, in terms of lack of fear and also lack of aggression. Whenever I go to Eastern Europe, it is something completely different. So my comments are based on my own experience, which is very different from, let's say, someone whose father was in Toronto or someone whose grandfather was in Vancouver. I am always trying to look at the situation with one eye to what is going on the old continent, from where these noxious ideas actually came. And once again, I do agree, we can be very proud of the Canadian society. It doesn't mean that the situation is getting better, and we should be vigilant. But indeed, I do agree that when comparing it to the depth of I would say different old hates, which are not only unique to Eastern but also to Western Europe, we are in a very, very favored position indeed.
Lisa, given that you're in New York City, I want to put the following question to you, and that is that there is a well-known tradition in the United States that everybody hates New York City. And some of the reasons are because it's so big and it's so wealthy and it swaggers so much and the Yankees play there. But I wonder if part of the reason is because there's so many Jews in New York. What's your view?
Well, I think it was in the 90s that Jesse Jackson was excoriated for making a comment about having to campaign in Hymietown, and he meant New York City. I think those days are kind of bygone now. What I do find is that European colleagues and friends who come to live in New York for extended periods are very, very surprised to see how comfortable the Jews of New York are and with their identities. And of course, the Jews of New York are extremely diverse. And they're, I've had Italian, Swedish, French friends just express complete amazement that Jews are so open and comfortable with their identities, with displaying symbols of Judaism and Jewish identity. And, even French friends just wondering that Jews who define themselves as secular will put the mezuzah, which is a symbol on their doorpost, indicating that it's a Jewish home. So I don't think that people dislike New York because it has a lot of Jews. They might dislike New York because it's a big, brash city that is very, domineering in the United States in terms of culture and the economy, but not specifically because it's a city that's full of Jews. And in fact, if you come to New York, I think that the people who probably you see the most, on the streets, for example, are probably more Hispanics than Jews. Yeah. But no, my sense is not that people are saying, well, it's too full of Jews, I don't like New York.
Okay.
No.
And Lisa, just for the record, I do dislike the Yankees, and it's got nothing to do with the fact that any Jews have ever played baseball for the team. Moving right along here.
I'm excited about that.
Hussein, let me share with you a comment made by Andrew Sullivan, the well-known blogger. has been on this program in the past. He wrote recently about the United States acting, quote, like a slave of the expansionist Jewish state. And he wrote that in a blog post about whether the United States should continue to give financial aid to Israel and Egypt. Rhetorical flourish there, or something more there?
It's definitely hyperbole. Does it cross the line or not? I mean, I certainly wouldn't have used that phrase. I think the implication is inaccurate. Okay, the United States, you can critique American policy, especially on the question of settlements and the extent to which the United States uses its bona fides with Israel to challenge its occupation policies or not, without indulging in that kind of hyperbole. Because American policy derives from a huge number of inputs, a part of which come from pro-Israel groups, and a part of those pro-Israel groups are Jewish. I think one of the most effective, supposedly pro-Israel forces in the United States is actually a group of people who are neither pro-Israel nor actually, and who are actually not philo-Semitic but anti-Semitic, and they are in the extreme dispensationalist, apocalyptic, sort of millennialist Christian evangelicals. And these people, they don't care about the future of Israel, and certainly don't envisage a future of happiness for Jews. They envisage an apocalyptic war in the Middle East provoked by Israel's settlement expansion policies, and the wiping out of everyone who isn't their kind of Christian, which would certainly include everyone who continue to identify themselves as a Jew. Now, if there isn't a more anti-Semitic vision for the future, I don't know what there is. But there's a willingness to overlook this on both sides. And the fact that these people don't support Israel but claim to and egg Israel on into policies that are actually self-defeating, like major settlement expansions, and on the Israeli side to sort of take the money and support from these people, knowing very well that they are among the biggest anti-Semites you can find in the United States, because among that percentage of people who would answer yes to that ridiculous question, did the Jews, whatever that means really, kill Christ, would say yes, and then turn around and be active major supporters of the settlement movement, but not of security and a long-term peaceful future for the state of Israel.
Staying in the region, let me now play a clip of Ali Abunimah, who is the editor of something called The Electronic Intifada. We had him on this program a few years ago. We're going to play his comments and then come back. John, I'll put the first question to you about what he's had to say. Roll tape, please. Is the one-state solution an inadvertent acknowledgement that Jews have an historic right to living in the historic land of Palestine?
I don't know what that historic right, where that historic right comes from. There is a historic right for the Palestinian people to live there, which has been systematically denied by those who reject the right of return of Palestinians who are expelled so that this Jewish state could be created on the ashes of their ancient communities. I think it's much more productive to talk about the rights that living human beings have. And I recognize that this is the country that belongs. As the South African Freedom Charter said, South Africa belongs to all who live in it. I believe Palestine, Israel, again, whatever you want to call it, belongs to all who live in it.
John, the notion that the Jews of Israel are not indigenous to the region equals anti-Semitism. Are you on side with that thought?
I think sometimes when you get into historical conspiracy theories, like for instance, Yasser Arafat once said that there was no historical evidence for the existence of the Jewish temple in that area. You enter such a realm of fantasy that the only possible psychological force to explain it is Jew hatred. In general, though, I think it is important to distinguish between anti-Zionist rhetoric and anti-Semitic rhetoric. And I think this is an issue we have to discuss, because I often get letters to the editor or op-eds with people talking about the rising anti-Semitism in Canada. And when I ask for evidence, what they will cite to me is rising anti-Israel sentiments.
So they really mean anti-Zionism.
Yeah. Now, as I say, sometimes anti-Zionism can become so shrill and conspiratorial and venomous that it clearly is motivated by anti-Semitism. But in most cases, it's not. And some of the most prominent anti-Israel advocates, or I would say anti-Zionist advocates in Canada, are in fact Jews. I'm thinking of someone like Naomi Klein. And it's important to distinguish this because I think the term anti-Semitism has fallen into abuse. There was an entire conference in Ottawa a couple of years ago purporting to fight anti-Semitism, but 90% of the rhetoric at that conference was actually about delegitimizing Israel. Now, I'm a Zionist. I support Israel. At the same time, I don't think we should play rhetorical tricks to try and confuse people who are mainstream anti-Zionists and anti-Semites, especially, by the way, since in most cases, I think anti-Zionism often is essentially an extension of Marxism. It's often people who hate the ruling class, who hate capitalism, who hate the United States, and a lot of their hatred of Israel is actually a displaced form of their Marxism, not necessarily their anti-Semitism.
One more video to introduce to you here. The people in this video are African Americans in Brooklyn talking about their ultra-religious Jewish neighbors. Roll tape, please.
They are supposed to be the chosen ones, but they be in a welfare office and a Section 8 office. They're the first ones to get any kind of bargain deal on anything. They're the first ones to get any kind of discount, or they know the system very well, okay? A lot of times they have all this money coming in the household, but somehow they always figure out a way to manage getting Section 8 or public assistance. Whatever services is available, trust me, the Jewish people are the first ones to find out about it.
Okay. Lisa, this is happening in your city, so let's start with you. Saying that the Jewish people have better access to services, is that in and of itself an anti-Semitic statement?
I mean, no, it's a stupid statement. Look, actually, that was not just shot in my city. That was shot precisely in my neighborhood where I live, and that's Crown Heights. And I know the director of that film. I've seen the entire film. It's hilarious, and sometimes, you know, if you go to the website for EBT, which is the food stamp system in the States, for New York City, they have it in about 6 different languages, including Yiddish, which is the language that Hasidic Jews speak. So, you know, obviously there is a desire and a need amongst the ultra-Orthodox Yiddish-speaking Jewish community. You know, I don't see any real tension in my neighborhood between blacks and Jews, and ultra-Orthodox Jews and blacks, and we live side by side alongside the hipsters and all the other encroaching gentrifiers. And I don't see any tension on the streets. There are lots of stupid people around who say stupid things. Does it really disturb me? Do I feel that those people are looking at me with suspicion or with hatred? Absolutely not. We have great relations as far as I can see. Okay,
well, this next video piece we're going to show is not stupid, it's more funny. Here's Mariah Carey singing All I Want for Christmas. Roll tape.
All I want for Christmas is Jews. Yeah, I won't ask for much this Christmas. I don't even wish for snow. Just want a Jew who runs show business. Spielberg, Stiller, Ari Gold. I will make a list and send it of my choices for St. Nick. Signed by Zach Braff and Jon Stewart are the boys with a big stick. I just want them here tonight.
Or maybe not the real Mariah Carey, but certainly a takeoff on the video that she did once upon a time. Jan, to you, is it anti-Semitic to point out that Jews have done very well in Hollywood? Thank you very much.
Well, the thing is that if you could say that Jews have done very well in very, very many areas of human pursuit. If you look at Hollywood, if you look at Nobel Prize winners, science, if you look at arts, no shame in doing well. And of course, the problem is that for anti-Semites, if the Jews do well, it is a bad thing. If they do not so well, it's also a bad thing. So basically, no matter what the Jews do, they will be damned one way or the other. and at the same time going back to this very powerful living stereotype. Just to give you an example, I recently came back from Poland, and you can buy in every single major store or market, you can buy a very nice painting of paintings of Jews counting gold coins, right? And they are very popular with people. You buy them because they bring good luck. You have association of Jews and good fortune, basically good luck charms, because the Jews are known through their association with money. Now, is it something that, once again, here you have a powerful stereotype in Hollywood, in science, and of course in banking circles. So these are the things that go all the way back to the Middle Ages and beyond, and they come back to the surface time and time and time again.
John, our last 30 seconds here tonight. Do you think some degree of anti-Semitism is simply here to stay?
Yes, and I would point people to the Family Guy episode called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein.
That's very funny, I gotta say.
It's a great episode, and Fox, even Fox, I think they balked at it. And if you look at it, it's the perfect mix of American satire culture and American self-awareness about, hey, you know, sometimes the Jews, there's some things they're kind of good at, and let's just acknowledge that and not say that it's anti-Semitic.
Did that ever air, or did they pull that?
It aired briefly, and it's available on YouTube, and I think if there's one parting thought for people, it's go watch that video. It contains wisdom, the likes of which we cannot communicate.
When in doubt, go to Peter Griffin.
Yeah, that's right. Gotcha.
With all of the expertise on this program, you're saying go watch Peter Griffin. Got it. Okay, thanks so much for everybody for this occasionally uncomfortable, but I thought very necessary discussion to have tonight on the agenda. Hussein Ibish, the Senior Fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Hussein, for being with us. Lisa Goldman, the Israeli-Canadian journalist and blogger out of New York City. Jan Grabowski, the professor of history at the University of Ottawa. His newest book, The Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland. And Jonathan Kay, the managing editor for the comments at The National Post. Thanks so much, everybody. Tonight's program is produced by Colin Ellis and Vudek Schemberg. And that is the agenda for Friday, November 8th, 2013. Monday on the program, we're going to pause and we're going to remember. First, as we approach the centennial of the outbreak of World War I, it's important to remember that 100 years ago today, virtually no one realized that the world was on the brink of one of the deadliest conflicts ever. We'll examine what lessons there are for us today in the shock of the outbreak of war. Then, 91-year-old World War II veteran Ed Haddon will be here to reflect back on his time serving Canada and what we can glean from his experience today. A special Remembrance Day program here on the agenda. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again on Monday.
Funding for the agenda with Steve Paikin is provided by Ontario's more than 36,500 chartered professional accountants, public policy leaders since 1879. More information is available at cpaontario.ca. And by contributions to TVO by viewers like you. Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.